Good morning, Guten Tag, everyone. My name's Dominic Black, and I'd like to welcome you all to CloudCom Summit Germany. It's a real shame we can't be in Munich this year. We've had the pleasure of being in Munich for the last 3 years and doing the event out there. But unfortunately, due to the current circumstances, we're having to do this virtually. Fingers crossed, this is the last time we'll be doing our virtual event in Germany, and next year we'll be coming back in person to come see you guys. So really excited about that. But for today, really excited about taking you through today. So as I said, this is our third event. I'd like to first say thank you to our sponsors. We're gladly and happily and thankfully sponsored by Cisco, nReach, Metaswitch, and Ring Central. And you'll be hearing from all of those sponsors today in their industry vision keynotes, giving their view in a short presentation on what's happening in the market as well. Also like to thank you. You can see our audio-visual sponsors, Poly, using their headsets. And as Francisca said, there's an opportunity to win one of those at the end in our quiz. But thank you very much to Poly and also all of our regional associate sponsors and our lunch segment sponsors, Q Advisors. On a quick run through of what we're going to be doing today, I'm going to be taking you on our opening keynote, looking at the German cloud communications market, some of the changes that we're seeing, and what you should be really thinking about as a service provider for the future. After that, we'll be getting a keynote from nReach, looking at their market vision, and then speaking to some of the major vendors around what the future they see of the communications market is on a panel. We'll then have Cisco speaking around business resiliency and designing your workforce and workplace for the future there, before a short speed networking and virtual expos break, time to grab yourself a coffee and recharge yourselves for the next couple of sessions. After that, my colleague Finbar Begley will be taking us through network strategy. Finbar covers cloud networking for us, so talking around the trends in SD-WAN, SASE, and how that really ties into the landscape of what we should be looking at and offering into the future. We'll then have Ring Central taking us through their industry vision as well, what they're seeing doing there, some interesting things that will coming out of that. And then into our next session delivered by Cavell. So my colleague Patrick Watson will be taking us through what's happening in Microsoft Teams and Azure. Patrick's had a huge wealth of experience looking at the Microsoft world and hopefully be sharing his thoughts on that. Following up from there, we'll be taking Metaswitch, who was acquired by Microsoft. So interested to see how those two tie together. Before we go into our market panel, where we're bringing together some of the key challenges and competitors within the German market, Starface, HFO, NFON, and nReach will be coming together to share what they're seeing in the German market from a service provider perspective and seeing how they see the market progressing in the future. After that, we'll have our friends from Q Advisors joining us. Q Advisors are one of the preeminent private equity and M&A providers in the market, talking around what they're seeing from an M&A perspective and how to prepare your business for a sale, but also what to look for if you're looking at acquiring a business as well. As we're going through this, there's obviously a lot of talk around growing with scale and growing with acquisitions. So really interesting to come into that. And to finalize, we'll be doing our quick treasure hunt quiz where you have the opportunity to win some prizes off the back of this. So I'll go into next slide, and just if you're interested in any other markets, this is part of a European Cloud Comet series. Yesterday we were in France virtually. Today we're in Germany, tomorrow in Benelux region, and then finally on Friday in Spain. If you're interested in any of those markets, please sign up. Should be really interesting, and it's kind of follows the same agenda, but with a real local look at what's happening in these markets. So without further ado, I'm going to head straight into our presentation. So firstly, I just want to talk a little bit about 2020. And obviously, it's been a really interesting year for most of us in the market. But I think the key thing that we've seen come out of it, that the 2020 wasn't just about the change and how things happen. It was really about the pace of change. If we think around, and from an analyst perspective, we have to sit there a lot. And I joined Cavell 8 years ago, and I was really excited looking at the cloud communications market. Well, cloud makes sense. It's the obvious decision for enterprises. It's what we should be doing. And looking at our forecasts, I was going, but these are really low. Why aren't we booming these forecasts forward? This seems an obvious choice. And everyone you speak to says, look, things happen, but things never happen at the speed that you expect. Now, I really think 2020's changed that now. It's really started rapidly moving forward, and we've seen adoption across the board of things happening at speeds that we haven't really seen before. Obviously, we saw a lot of people at the start of lockdown having to go into a lockdown in March. And for enterprises, the speed of having to make that decision of, okay, we're now going to have to shut down our offices. We're now going to have to work from home. Making that decision and making that kind of move to home working was really something they had to make within a few days. And a lot of people were fairly unprepared for that. We also saw this whole speed of having to manage your business and learn new ways of managing a remote workforce. And for the employees, learn how to be a remote workforce, which is a real struggle for a lot of people. How do you actually work remotely? And there wasn't much training or anything out there. And people said, well, I've done this for a long time. But realistically, the vast majority of the population didn't know how to do this and had to learn these skills really quickly. If we look at some of the technology trends in this, enterprises in Germany using video in 2019, only 14% were using video internally to communicate, either with their customers or internally. That rose to 59% of enterprises in 2020. It's a massive increase in video usage for businesses. And obviously, we've been talking about video within business for such a long time. And it's only really happened this year, and it's been this forceful thing that's had to drive this forward. Also, when we look at Germany, it's compared to other European markets and Western European markets, the adoption of cloud technology in general has been lower. In 2019, only 38% of businesses were using at least one cloud application, and that's risen to 47% of businesses now using at least one cloud application. And if you look deeper into that, more and more enterprises are using multiple cloud applications. And that's interesting a little bit later on when we look at how we're going to integrate all of those together and what the role of the service provider is there. From a perspective also of, okay, what happened from the market perspective, things moved really quickly. We obviously saw quite a lot of growth at the start of 2020 and some pretty steady growth as people were moving to the cloud. But that month of March and going into April really saw things start to move quickly. We saw obviously a slowdown for a lot of providers after they'd done that initial shift. So where people were begging to go, right, we need a solution. How do we do that? We saw massive rapid growth at the very start of March, and then it kind of slowed off. As soon as lockdown finished, though, we saw another massive wave of people moving to the cloud as they come out of lockdown and say, we need to protect my business for the future. And since that time, we've seen massive growth in cloud adoption across the board, across the whole of Europe, as cloud is really now the predominant service that people are looking for. And that's a great thing for our businesses here. Another area just to look at the rapid adoption of technologies has been Microsoft Teams. And if you look at these dates in green, in light green, are the ones that Microsoft publicly have given out here. So if we look across the charts here, in Q2 2020, when they released their figures there, we were predicting there was about 3 million of these Microsoft Teams users were in Germany out of the 75, 80 million at that time. But looking from this back in July 2019 at 15 million users, growing it at about 4 million users a month pre-COVID. Then we hit March, and there's a massive increase there. 30 million new users added from March to April onto Microsoft Teams from a daily active user perspective. And then since then, we've seen a huge adoption still going on, growing at 6.5 million users a month as well. So this adoption is still ramping up here. Yes, there was a massive jump in March and April, but we're seeing huge growth here of cloud technologies and collaboration and video. And the big thing here is, what does this really mean for businesses? And what does this mean for them? So one thing we've seen is communications are now being demystified. No longer are we going and sort of saying to businesses, well, video is something that you should be doing. Everyone and their parents and their kids know how to use video communications now. And they've all been using it for the last few months. Adoption's been throughout the roof here. And one thing that comes through this, though, is people expect their communications now to be really easy, really usable, and being able to be adopted across the whole company. And really doesn't matter what device you're using on, be it a laptop, a tablet, a phone. They want to be able to use all these devices, and they've been using them for the last few months. And from a provider perspective, you've got to make sure that your solutions are as easy to use, are as easy to adopt, to come through on this. We also saw a number of challenges come up during COVID. The number one came through was security issues. And we've had this is all from our enterprise research that we've been doing. We did a study of 800 businesses across Europe out of a wider study of 2,000 businesses globally. And the biggest issue that came through for most of these businesses, we say, was security. How do you secure that edge? How do I secure my collaboration solutions? How do I secure all my home workers now they're working from home? Another thing that came through was internal culture. How do I replicate my internal culture back at home when all my company is now spread across multiple different locations? How do I maintain that? How do I keep that coming through? And that's where we saw a lot of video coming in of people trying different things to keep that culture alive through that. So one of the interesting things when we looked at why people adopted collaboration, internal culture wasn't one of those, but really was one of those benefits that came through from adopting video. We also saw obviously massive issues with end users not having the right hardware to do remote working. Across the board, across the whole of Europe and North America, we saw end users working out how do you get people laptops, how do you get people phones to go and work from home, and was really a struggle for a lot of businesses of how they can continue and maintain that business continuity as people working from home. And the last point on this was the existing solutions lacked or required capabilities. We saw a large number of providers or enterprises, having to go and find new providers for collaboration solutions because their existing providers just didn't have the capabilities they needed. No longer could they go, well, we only need a phone service from you. They needed that holistic collaboration solution, including video, including team messaging, and including security to some extent as well in this. So that was a real headache for a lot of businesses out there. And in the future, they're going to have a lot of ranges of these challenges going forward as well. Not only are they going to have to manage this remote workforce, we're seeing from our research that yes, this remoteness of the workforce is staying, but also now we're going to have people going back to the office. So how do you deliver that best communication and working experience to all of your employees, regardless of location? How do you keep that culture alive when half the team are working from their homes and half the team are coming into the office? That's going to be a real challenge for businesses going forward. The other point is security everywhere. How do you secure every single device in the network, regardless of what location it is? If it's out on the road, if it's out at someone's home, if it's in the office, it's a real headache now for security for the network teams within enterprises and the security teams within enterprise and the IT teams to really work out how do you secure the whole infrastructure and your whole network. And that's a real opportunity, we think, for providers to play that role. The other point on this challenge is how do enterprises migrate to the cloud? We've seen massive adoption of cloud technologies throughout this. And the big thing for enterprises is how do I now move all of those to the cloud and where can I add value in this by integrating these together? And that really comes down to this vendor selection. And what we've seen across the board is that those providers who haven't got a cloud strategy now have to have had a cloud strategy. And that's not just for the communications, that's for all different services as businesses now are going, right, how do I bring this together? How do I move everything into cloud? How do I integrate all these together? So this vendor selection is really key for them going out and making sure those tick boxes are the same as what they were previously of what they're looking for. So to wrap up a little bit on what the enterprise is looking for, businesses and communication is now a business critical service. Enterprises need to have this in here, and the IT buyer and the communications buyer has become one of the most important people in the business because no longer are they just delivering a phone service or internet access. They're really delivering the way this company is going to survive in the future and thrive, depending if we go into more lockdowns. So communications is now key. This conversation is now elevated up from IT into the boardroom of how do we do this. The move to cloud as well is no longer a when, but it's a now. How do we move to the cloud? What solutions do we move to the cloud? And what applications move to the cloud? And that's a great thing to hear from our industry. And we've already, from speaking to service providers across Germany and into the wider across Europe, that the cloud adoption is really booming at the moment. It's a great place for us to be in. The other areas we've got to think around is, if you can't, from a service provider perspective, meet new requirements around cloud and video and cloud, you're not going to be in this discussion anymore. These are kind of two of the key things that people are looking for, is how do we have these solutions in here? And also, as we'll be looking at a little bit later, you're no longer competing with just local providers. There's huge brands and huge competitors coming into the German market that we need to keep an eye on. So what's this mean for the industry? I want to kind of touch on a couple of key points which back up what we've been saying from the enterprise perspective here. If we look at the awareness of some of these collaboration solutions, obviously the awareness of them has absolutely boomed in the last year. Zoom, when we did the study last year, only about 23% of enterprises had heard of Zoom. That's now up to just under 80%. Microsoft Teams, obviously quite a lot of people have heard of this before, and now it's gone more and more, and it's becoming a really important solution within this marketplace. And Cisco WebEx Teams, as you can see, not as much visualization of that, but really, if we look at in this in larger enterprise space, huge number of people realize and see who Microsoft are and what WebEx Teams provides. It's around 80% of the market of enterprises above 250 users know of WebEx and know of WebEx as a collaboration solution. And what we're seeing is this video collaboration is here to stay. And there were some clear winners coming out of this. We've obviously seen Microsoft win that, kind of grown to over 150 million daily active users. We saw splitting into this, it's really around the large companies as well. Only 29% of SMBs saying that they're using Microsoft Teams, whereas 71% of large businesses we spoke to said they're using Microsoft Teams. That's different from Zoom, where we saw really it's around the SMB only. So majority of Zoom's users have been in the SMB. We see it much more focused towards that smaller end of the market. Again, Microsoft, 48% of large enterprises say that they're using Cisco WebEx, whereas only a small proportion of SMBs do. However, that's going to be interesting going forward in the future, with WebEx just launching their WebEx for BroadWorks solution. So expect to see WebEx penetration, WebEx Teams starting to be used by much smaller businesses as the BroadWorks base starts rolling that solution out as well. Google Hangouts and Google Meet's been an interesting one as well. And it's kind of the hidden competitor, I would say, who we don't see too much of, but definitely gaining some traction on their Google Meet solution that they're growing there. They also have a strong collaboration and calling proposition, really targeted towards the very small end of the market. And we expect to see potentially over the next few years, Google growing in a bit of focus in here as well. And with this video and collaboration, looking at why this is here to stay. There's a study that a research firm did about 5-6 years ago around how long it takes for you to form a habit. And it's 66 days on average. And if we think over the last year, how many days we've used video instead of calling, this habit is here to stay. Video is definitely here to stay, and it's got to be part of that. This habit's formed already. So looking a bit further into the future, what does the future hold for the market? Now, we do our cloud communications forecast every 6 months, and the latest one we did was in Q2 2020. As you can see here, we're forecasting the market to grow probably less than it is. So the red column there, Q4 2020, growing in the next 6 months to just over 2.5 million users. We actually think that's going to be a lot faster in the next few months, as we've seen massive adoption of cloud, and all the providers we're speaking to are seeing really great cloud adoption. If we look at the forecast penetration as well over the next 5 years, we're seeing massive increases in penetration. Germany is one of the lowest and least penetrated markets and least mature markets in Europe. And we've always, every provider we speak to has said, well, this is a huge opportunity for us. This is certainly a market we want to be playing in. And as you can see here, this ramp up over the next 5 years, moving towards just under 25% penetration of cloud over the next 5 years, is a huge increase of where we are now at about 7 and 8% penetration. So there's a huge opportunity in the German market. And as you can see, it's across all different sizes of different segments. In terms of market and total addressable market, in the whole of 2024, the market's going to be worth around 760 million euros. So a massive market opportunity to go after here. In terms of a user base, we're adding around 4.2 million users over the next 5 years. 1.7 million of these are going to be in the SMB space, in the sub 50 user space. So there's a huge opportunity down there as well. So as we can see from here, yes, we're seeing adoption, and we think that adoption is going to increase massively going forward. So a great opportunity, a great market to be in. One of the issues coming out of that, though, is from a German perspective and the providers operating in this market, it's no longer just your local providers operating here. What we're seeing here is a much more consolidated picture, as we're seeing more and more people coming into the market. As you can see on the left-hand side, we started to see the European consolidators entering into the German market in growing scale across Europe. Gamma making the acquisition of HFO, and we'll be hearing from a CEO of HFO Group later on. Enreach buying multiple different providers across Europe. And again, we'll be hearing from Enreach around what that means there as well. We're also, outside of that, seeing Destiny expanding out from their Belgian location into the French market with the acquisition of OpenIP, but also into the Dutch market, making a lot of acquisitions there, a lot around network, but also bringing lots of these voice providers up together. Other providers coming in that we see kind of growing on this European consolidation scale. Seiwan, big French provider, bought 42.1, which was 42com in the German market, as well as Bozelia in Spain and Freestar Networks in Belgium. So starting on a smaller basis to make that European expansion there, but interesting providers to keep an eye on. And then Firstcom, a smaller company, only around sort of 30-40 million euro revenue, but buying different providers in different markets and growing this European scale, as they all see that this scale is becoming more and more important, and also having an international presence is going to be more important here. So from a German perspective, you're starting to see these bigger brands coming into the market who are going to replicate what they've done in other markets successfully and bringing that in there. So seeing more competition coming in there as well. We're also seeing the US cloud specialists, cloud communication specialists coming in there as well. So 8x8, RingCentral, Zoom, Vonage, all entering and expanding out across European markets. And Zoom's an interesting one I want to kind of spend a couple of minutes talking around. Is Zoom isn't just around the collaboration piece now. They have got a proposition called Zoom Phone. They've got it launched in 40 countries worldwide now. And that proposition is really interesting when you think about how many users are using Zoom from a collaboration perspective and how easy that might be to move them onto their UC platform. So I think it's going to be really interesting looking at how Zoom's going to grow in terms of users on Zoom Phone, but definitely a big competitor coming in with scale, with a large customer base that they can leverage into growth there. From the other aspect as well as these hyperscalers, Amazon have been launching various products in our market, in the cloud communications market with Amazon Connect, Amazon Chime. Be interesting to see what they do if they start bringing a real competitive piece in there. We see a lot of businesses building on AWS, and that could be a big challenger there. Facebook has their workplace products, so gaining quite a lot of traction in terms of that enterprise communication internally using Facebook platform. Quite interesting if you're looking at what they're doing, how they build their customer base up from that. We've mentioned Google earlier with their voice proposition. What their strategy is if you're signing up as a new business, is adding a voice service to that business is really easy, really simple, and almost a click of the button. So definitely focused towards those smaller businesses, how they're going to be using Google Voice there. Microsoft, I'm going to leave for a moment because I think my colleague Patrick's going to really dive into the Microsoft opportunity and threat going forward in the future, but definitely one of the key providers in this market. And then two, Salesforce and Twilio, who you might not really put in this category, but for those who don't know, Salesforce bought Slack last night. So Slack was one of the biggest, largest kind of independent competitors to Microsoft Teams and WebEx Teams as well. Salesforce spent just under $28 billion on Slack, which was announced last night. So you think about Salesforce from a CRM perspective and a customer management perspective, now bringing that enterprise communications piece in there could start to be a real competitor in this space going forward. And the last one there is Twilio. Twilio is a fascinating business as you look at it. We've been tracking it quite a long time as really developer focused on embedding voice into different applications, but recently launched about a year and a half ago their Twilio Flex proposition in the contact center space, and expect to see quite a lot of growth coming through on that, both from a SIP trunking perspective, but also from people building applications and embedding communications within different applications, which we see is going to be quite a big growth area for them. Another area we've got to think around is PBX. And that's been one of the things that's held back this market. But I challenge anyone to name a PBX vendor that now doesn't have a cloud strategy. All of the PBX vendors we've been speaking to have got a fairly clear, defined cloud strategy. And I'd say some of the major ones only really defined that within the last 12 months or so. If we take, for example, and RingCentral will be looking at this later on, but RingCentral signing Avaya, signing Atos, signing Alcatel was a huge deal for the market. And for all those vendors, they didn't really have that cloud strategy, but now have a great opportunity to migrate that PBX base over to cloud. If we think from the Cisco side, if you look at what they've been doing on their on-premise deployments compared to their cloud deployments, making a really seamless journey for anyone who's on an on-premise PBX, that user interface is exactly the same as what you'd have on a cloud interface. So that migration strategy and migration journey is so easy for those businesses. They don't have to do retraining or reskilling of their employees. They can just make that move to cloud really simply and easy and benefit, obviously, off all the back of that. Other areas, Mitel obviously been working on this as well and building their cloud strategy out across Europe. So from a market perspective, it's no longer, okay, well, this PBX vendor is not doing cloud. Everyone is now doing cloud, and that brings in a benefit to the market as there's no longer competing, saying, well, we need on-premise. Everyone's seeing that cloud is the future, but it does obviously raise more competition in the marketplace. So as a service provider, how can you add value, and how is this changing? If we look at the previous value chain of where people were buying communications and why they were getting their value, it's around those changes in work practices, so more people doing this. It's around business process improvement. It's around the pricing structure, and it's around, from an enterprise perspective, how do I leverage my infrastructure internally to use the best communication? Now, from a service provider point of view, these are the messaging that we're seeing really resonate and where this value is really being pushed through. It's around enabling that anywhere working, no longer just, oh, well, we're going to have some remote workers. It's anywhere. It could be on the road, it could be on mobile, it could be at home, it could be in the office. It's around that whole piece there. And through that, it's enabling collaboration and also the integration of other relevant tools around this. And that's becoming a massive focus now, is around integration, key business processes. And that's where we think service providers should be looking at adding value in the future. We've been doing a lot of interviews over the last few months with channel organizations, and they're getting asked the whole time of how do I bring all these cloud applications together, integrate them together on top of that. Other areas around this is obviously around improving customer engagement. As more and more businesses are competing with each other, working out how to manage those engagements with customers. And not just we're talking about contact center here. We're talking about integrating email into that, integrating messaging into that. We've seen a massive rise in chatbots over the last few years as people look at, if someone's hit my website, how do I communicate with them immediately? And that kind of growth in customer engagement is a really interesting trend coming through there. We also see, and from what we touched on a few minutes ago, looking at some of those international competitors, that consistent approach across multiple different markets is a really great value add there for enterprises who have an international organization, as they want all of their people to have a consistent approach. And that becomes even more important from a collaboration perspective. If you've got a multinational company, you're going to want to have the same collaboration tools for all of your employees. You're not going to be wanting to use one service in one place and one service in another. So as a provider, you've got to work out how you can get your whole suite to be used in multiple different locations there. So to kind of scale this down and go, okay, what are the 4 things we need to look at? And what are the 4 areas that people are looking at growing and how they can be a successful provider in the future? The first is speed. How do you get new technologies to market quickly? How do you look at what the enterprise is doing and go, right, how do we develop this new feature? How do we integrate this new feature? How do we do this? And speed is of the essence now. You can no longer be a provider going, well, we'll do a release once a year of new features. It's got to be on a much faster time scale here. As you've got to keep up, you've got to be a SaaS company now. You've got to be a technology company. You can no longer be a carrier and operating at the speed that you used to. Another area could be scale. So how do you grow quickly? How do we acquire customers quickly? How do we get them on board quickly? And that scale piece is we're seeing a massive increase in M&A activity and people coming into the market as they're trying to grow up quickly, bringing on new customers, bringing on new channels to market. Back to this point that we spoke about earlier, simplicity becomes really important. So how do we make our solution as simple as easy for the end users to use? No longer do you want to have sort of 3 applications you want to jump between. You've got to have that really simple user interface that people, when they're using it, go, okay, it's quick and easy to use. One of the reasons that Zoom was so successful was because it was so simple. You could send someone a link and they could load it, and that was great. People don't want that headache of having to go around and using different applications for different things. And the last area, which we think is going to be really key, is the specialism point. A lot of providers aren't going to be able to scale up, and there is this massive scale of other providers coming in. But if you're able to really specialize in a certain area, we think that's a great opportunity there. And through that specialism, that's looking at different verticals, looking at different applications you can integrate into that to really build a proposition that's going to work for your end customers. So we think that specialism is going to be building that niche out. It's going to be great for a lot of providers out the back there. So I hope that gives everyone a bit of thought for the day of where we are, what we're doing. And I'd like to thank you again for joining us. We've got a great morning of sessions, so I hope you all learn from it. And please question us, come and speak to us, question our panelists, raise questions throughout it. It's a learning experience for everyone here. And last but not least is network. We know it's not as good as going face to face, but we've built some great tools here, like our speed networking, like going to the booths, which we hope kind of replicates that experience. So please do. Thank you all again for joining us. And I'd like to finish off there by saying we'll be having Enreach starting in a few moments. So please wait and speak to you soon.